Hello. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today for another English listening practice session. Today we're going to work on a technique called shadowing. Shadowing is when you listen to English and repeat what you hear at the same time. This technique has amazing benefits for your English learning. As we go through today's story, I encourage you to pause after each sentence and try to repeat it out loud. Don't worry about being perfect. The goal is to practice and improve gradually. Now, are you ready? Let's dive into the STO.
My name is Sophie. I am 28 years old. I work as a librarian at the Portland Public Library in Oregon. I have lived in the same neighborhood for 3 years, and I thought I knew every street and corner around my apartment. I was wrong. Last Thursday evening, I decided to take a walk through Laurelhurst Park. I walk through the park almost every day after work, always taking the same path around the pond, past the playground, and back to my street. But that evening was different. The main path was blocked by construction workers repairing the walkway. A small handwritten sign pointed toward a narrow trail I had never noticed before. The sign read, "Alternate route, follow the blue markers." I had no choice but to take the detour. I live alone in a small apartment 6 blocks from the library. My routine is simple and predictable. I wake up at 6:30, make coffee and toast, walk to work along the same streets, spend my days organizing books and helping people find information. I come home, cook dinner, and take my evening walk through the park. I like routine. It makes me feel safe and in control. My parents moved to Seattle when I got my library job. I have a few friends from work, but most evenings I prefer to be alone with my books. I have always been more comfortable with stories than with people. But on Thursday evening, my comfortable routine led me somewhere completely unexpected. The narrow trail wound through a section of the park I had never explored. Ancient oak trees created a canopy so thick that very little sunlight reached the ground. The blue markers were small painted stones placed every 20 feet along the path. After walking for about 10 minutes, I reached a clearing I didn't know existed. In the center stood a small stone bench surrounded by wildflowers. Behind the bench was something that made me stop and stare. It was a tree house. Not a children's tree house, but a real structure built into the branches of an enormous old maple tree. The tree house had glass windows, a small wooden door, and electric lights inside. Someone was living there. I stood frozen for several minutes, unsure what to do. The tree house looked inhabited, but I couldn't see anyone around. There was a small garden beneath the tree with vegetables and herbs growing in neat rows. A narrow ladder led up to the front door. I had discovered a secret home in the middle of a city park. I walked closer to examine the tree house. It was beautifully constructed with careful attention to detail. The wood was weathered but well maintained. Small solar panels on the roof explained the electricity. A handmade sign hung next to the ladder, "Welcome, curious visitor. Please respect this space. MK." I was torn between curiosity and respect for someone's privacy. As I turned to leave, I heard a voice behind me. "You found my home." I spun around and saw an elderly woman emerging from behind the tree. She was small and thin, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a faded denim jacket and carried a basket full of herbs from her garden. The woman smiled at my surprised expression. She told me her name was Margaret Kelly, and she had been living in the tree house for 12 years. She said most people never found the clearing because they always stayed on the main paths. I introduced myself and apologized for intruding. Margaret laughed and said the park belonged to everyone. She had just found a creative way to make it her home. I was fascinated by her situation. Margaret's story was more complex than I had imagined. She explained that she had been a landscape architect for the Portland Parks Department for 35 years. When she retired in 2011, she had nowhere to go. Her pension was small, and housing costs in Portland had become impossible for her to afford. Margaret had worked on the original design plans for Laurelhurst Park in the 1980s. She knew every section of the park, including areas that were rarely visited by the public. She had helped plant many of the mature trees that now provided perfect camouflage for her treehouse. She had built her home slowly and carefully over several months, using her knowledge of the park's maintenance schedule to work when no one else was around. She had chosen materials that would blend with the natural environment and maintain the clearing beautifully. Margaret invited me to sit on the stone bench and tell her about myself. I found myself sharing details about my life that I rarely discussed with anyone. When I mentioned that I often felt lonely despite living in a large city, Margaret nodded with understanding. She told me that loneliness had been one of the hardest parts of living in the treehouse. But gradually, other people had discovered her clearing. She had developed friendships with several of her accidental visitors who brought her books, helped with grocery shopping, and visited regularly. She had created an informal community of people who shared a secret. As we talked, I realized that Margaret represented something I had been missing in my own life. She had found a way to live authentically and independently, even in difficult circumstances. Margaret asked if I would like to see inside her treehouse. I was honored by her invitation. The interior was compact but comfortable, like a tiny apartment. She had a small kitchen area, a reading corner with hundreds of books, and a sleeping loft under the roof. Everything was organized efficiently and decorated with handmade crafts and found objects from the park. She showed me photo albums documenting the construction of her treehouse and the changes in her garden over the years. She had kept detailed records of the wildlife that visited her clearing, turning her unconventional living situation into a scientific study of urban ecology. As the sun began to set, Margaret offered to make tea. We sat by her small window, watching the light fade through the leaves. She told me about her decision to live in the park. After retiring, she had tried living in a small apartment, but she felt disconnected from the natural world she had spent her career protecting. The tree house had started as a temporary solution, but it had become the home of her dreams. Living in the park had taught her to pay attention to seasonal changes, weather patterns, and the daily rhythms of urban wildlife. She felt more connected to her environment than she had ever felt in a conventional house. Margaret also told me about the challenges, being extremely careful about water usage and waste disposal, staying invisible to park crews and police, planning for weather extremes. But the benefits outweighed the difficulties. As I walked back through the park that evening, I thought about Margaret's courage and creativity. She had solved her housing problem in a way that most people would never consider, building a life that aligned with her values. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about my encounter with Margaret. The following week, I decided to visit her again, bringing a field guide to Pacific Northwest birds I thought she might enjoy. Margaret seemed genuinely happy to see me again. She accepted the book gratefully and invited me to stay for dinner. As we ate vegetables from her garden, she told me more about her daily routine and observations of park life. Margaret asked if I would be interested in helping her with a project, creating a small lending library in the clearing where visitors could exchange books. The idea excited me immediately. Over the next month, we worked together to build a weatherproof book exchange box. I started visiting Margaret every weekend, and she introduced me to two other regular visitors, David, a retired teacher, and Lisa, a graduate student in environmental science. I realized that Margaret had created something special, not just a place to live, but a community center for people who valued simplicity, creativity, and connection with nature. Through my friendship with Margaret, I started questioning my own lifestyle choices and exploring other sections of the park I had never visited. Margaret had taught me to see my familiar neighborhood with new eyes. 6 months after our first meeting, Margaret received a letter from the Parks Department. Someone had reported seeing smoke from her clearing, and officials were planning to investigate. Margaret was not surprised, but I was determined to help her find a solution. I researched housing options and city policies, arranging meetings with social workers and contacting a local reporter interested in housing issues. Margaret's story attracted attention from city officials and housing advocates. Her decades of service to the Parks Department and her careful stewardship of the clearing had earned respect from many people. Within 2 months, Margaret was offered a small apartment in subsidized senior housing with a balcony for plants, just 2 blocks from Laurelhurst Park. She accepted but asked to maintain her garden in the clearing as a volunteer. On moving day, we dismantled the tree house carefully and removed all traces of her residence. But we left the garden, the stone bench, and the book exchange, which the Parks Department agreed to maintain as a quiet space for visitors. Margaret's new apartment is comfortable and safe, but she still spends most of her days in the park. I visit her at least twice a week, and our friendship has enriched my life in ways I never expected. Through Margaret, I learned that home is not just about having an address, it's about finding a place where you can live authentically and contribute to something meaningful. I also learned that curiosity can lead to wonderful discoveries. If I had not been willing to follow that detour through the park, I never would have found Margaret's clearing. Now when I take my evening walks, I pay attention to paths I haven't explored, looking for hidden corners and unexpected spaces that might contain their own stories. Margaret continues to inspire me with her creativity, resilience, and commitment to living according to her values. She turned what could have been a desperate situation into an adventure that enriched her life and the lives of everyone who found her treehouse. Every time I visit the clearing now, I remember that first evening when construction forced me to take a different route. That small detour changed my life by introducing me to one of the most remarkable people I have ever met. If you take anything from my story, let it be this: sometimes the most important discoveries happen when we're willing to follow the unfamiliar path, even when we don't know where it leads. The next time you see a detour sign or a trail you've never explored, consider following your curiosity. You never know what or whom you might find waiting in the places you haven't been looking. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment and tell me about a time when taking an unexpected path led you to an important discovery. Your engagement helps other English learners find these stories and practice their listening skills.